Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Defeating the Dictators, How Democracy Can Prevail in the Age of the Strongman. Our speaker today is Charles Dunst. He's Deputy Director of Research and Analytics at the Asia Group. He's also an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic International Studies. Our moderator is a longtime friend of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council Town Hall, John Emerson, who is the former U.S. Ambassador to Germany. He's also Vice Chairman of the Capital Group International. For those of you who would like to ask Charles and John questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Just type your questions in there. Rachel Kenderdine will be managing our questions during the Q&A portion, which should start in about 35 minutes. So with that, John, let me turn this over to you. We can't wait for this conversation to start.
Well, thanks so much, Kim. Thanks for having me back, and thanks for having Charles and this giving the profile to this important book at a very crucial time. When we think about the president's focus on kind of restoring and supporting democracy around the world, we think about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which actually started back in 2014, but as we all know, accelerated dramatically about a year and a quarter ago, and just the challenges that democracies are facing globally. I can't think of a more timely or important book than the one that Charles has written for us today. So Charles, first of all, welcome. I gather you're in Washington, D.C. today, as I'm sitting in Los Angeles. So it's great to have a transcontinental discussion here. But why don't you talk a little bit about why you decided to write this book in the first place?
Sure. Thanks, John, and thanks, Kim, and thanks to the World Affairs Council for having me. It's really great to join everyone. So in terms of my background and why I came to write the book, it was, I will say, a little bit of an accident in the sense of I had been a journalist in Southeast Asia, working for the LA Times, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and a variety of American publications. And I lived in Cambodia, which is pretty hardened autocracy. I'd done some work in Vietnam, and I'd done some work in Myanmar, which was at the time trending in kind of the quasi-democratic direction. And I remember traveling across the region to places like Singapore. I previously lived in Hungary. And I remember kind of thinking about, well, these are very different forms of autocracy in the sense of Cambodia and Singapore can barely be described in the same sentence, in that Cambodia is not a functional country. It's one of the maybe 30 poorest countries in the world. And Singapore is obviously at the other end of the spectrum. And yet they're both undemocratic. And I think when I traveled around Southeast Asia and talked to folks, and this was in the Trump era, where you kind of talk to folks in developing countries who were saying, well, what is our model for development? What is our model for the future? I was hearing a lot of people say, well, we want to be like Singapore, or even we want to be like Vietnam, or even people saying, well, we want China's double-digit growth rates. We don't want the messiness of US democracy, of UK democracy, or even kind of the slowdown of Japan. There was this notion of autocracy being the future. And that was really troubling to me. And honestly, this book came about when I was living in London, where I'd kind of gone back and forth with this agent. I wanted to write a Vietnam book, and no one wanted a Vietnam book. And this publisher approached my agent and said, well, we want something a little different on autocracy. We've heard a lot about what the problem is. And I said, yeah, I agree. There are a lot of books talking about why democracy is in decline and why people are voting for kind of Viktor Orban types, as in Hungary, and lots of connections made between Orban and Trump and Bolsonaro and kind of the rise of the illiberal populists. And there's much less out there about how to actually stop that from happening. And what I wanted to do was write a really affirmative case for democracy and make the case for why democracy is a better system, highlight what's gone wrong and what we need to do to actually fix it. So a little bit of a happy accident in the sense from pivoting from kind of traditional journalism to being more in this think tank, policy advocacy, kind of argumentative space.
Oh, that sounds great. Talk a little bit about your research process. I mean, how did you, you said there was a lot out there about why democracy is failing, et cetera, but how did you go about researching and coming up with the conclusions that you articulate in your book?
Sure. I mean, some of it was built off of previous reporting and kind of previous travels, where the book opens up with the description of landing in Singapore and kind of
Yeah, I remember that.
when I was living in Cambodia, and you fly from Cambodia to Singapore and you're like, what world am I in? I mean,
Yeah.
you've pivoted from one of the 30 poorest countries in the world to maybe the best airport in the world, and it's just very disconcerting. So some of it was just anecdotal and stuff like that. I went through a lot of old newspapers, is what I did actually, like the New York Times archives. It's really interesting to see what people were writing about Japan in the 1980s. I mean, I think I have this notion of people talking about Japan's infrastructure as the best in the world in the 1980s, and I forget the correspondent's name, but he said something. It's like New York City, except everything works, which
Yeah,
is kind of
that's a great
pithy
one.
quote. And as a native New Yorker, not entirely wrong. But I think it was a lot of archival research like that. It was wading through a lot of academic papers as well, and really thinking of, well, there are really great findings in here, but they're, findings that are going to be read by 5 people in Cambridge and Oxford and maybe at USC. But it was basically this kind of for the small academics. And I'm thinking, well, let me take some of these findings and articulate them and include them in my own writing. So I think one of the examples was the cities that became London and Paris were the cities with the best Roman infrastructure, because it was this notion of the infrastructure actually built around London or around Paris allowed them to become centers of commerce and become the capitals of these powerful countries in a way that, sure, could have been Liverpool, could have been Manchester, but it wasn't. So I think it was a mix of archival research, some academic research, definitely did some reporting kind of off the more on background, honestly, than, talking to some friends who are diplomats around the world and kind of just gathering their sense of kind of the state of this autocracy democracy competition, not necessarily quoting them on the record so much, but definitely using those journalistic skills to inform the piece for sure.
So, you mentioned that there have been a ton written about the decline of democracy, why citizens are in, countries that we would consider the West, although I know there's some concern that that's not exactly the best description. Let's just say democracies that are more aligned with the United States as allies, beginning to push back against democracy in recent years. While there's been a lot written about that, just to make sure we get everybody on the same page as we move to your solutions discussion, can you sort of summarize why that is and what the essential findings have been in terms of that?
Sure. I mean, I think the broad answer, and I'm more of an economics focused person here, where I basically think since the end of the Cold War, the West did not take the steps necessary to cement our power in the wake of the Soviet Union's dissolution. I think there was a little bit of subconsciously, certainly not consciously, but subconscious kind of laziness, this sense of, well, our system has won out. We don't need to actually tend to it. It's won, it's fine. This garden has sprouted and now we're good. Where, of course, as anyone knows, you have to tend to these things and actually make sure they're up to date. So I would argue that at home, we kind of said, oh, well, we've won. So we let our safety nets decline. We'll let money kind of seep into and weaken our politics. And abroad, obviously, kind of, I would say, like high on the supply of the end of the Cold War, you went out and kind of did these ill-conceived wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think when you actually think about Western foreign policy to some extent, we also, at the end of the Cold War, promised countries like Hungary and Russia that by rapidly deregulating and democratizing, they would become rich. But rapid deregulation actually left them both poorer and a state of shock. And really, in Russia's case, it was a complete disaster. And I would argue that by deregulating our financial systems at home as well, we kind of set the world up. I mean, we being the broader West, certainly not just the United States, for the crises of 97 and 2008, which if you actually go back and read it now and think what were Chinese policymakers saying in 2008, it was all these comments of, well, we learned from the West for so long in terms of economics, but now it's over. There are all these comments of people saying, well, you steered us down this wrong path, so now it's our time to kind of develop something different. So the short end of it is we became too confident and too complacent, both at home and abroad. And I think the broad take is our democracy's performance, we just allowed it to wane and we allowed it to decline. And the result, as you've seen in the United States, in Brazil, in the UK, kind of really around the world, was to fuel voters' autocratic impulse, their sense that democracy is not working. So why not try something different? Why not try something like an illiberal populist in Trump or Bolsonaro? Why not try something like Brexit? I think that is really how I think about it. And certainly in a variety of countries, there's a kind of a difference between how much do kind of ethnic and national identity concerns play a role. I think certainly more in Hungary than in the United States, but of course, it's part of the reason why Trump had so much support was being anti-immigration. But when it comes down to it, I think it really is about economics, and I think it really is mostly about people feeling that the system just hasn't worked for them for the better part of 3 decades at this point.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned the why not try Brexit. I mean, that's been such an absolute disaster. Has that caused at least people in the UK to sort of, step back and rethink it? Although that may not necessarily, that may be an argument for democracy, because it was a vote that led to the Brexit itself. But what's your take on that?
Well, it's interesting. So Gideon Rockman, who's the Financial Times.
Yeah, no, he's terrific.
So Gideon reviewed my book positively, I will say, but he wrote a column maybe 3 or 4 months ago actually saying that the UK should hold another referendum about whether or not to rejoin the EU. And certainly I don't think that's likely, but it's indicative to me of this reality of voters actually realizing that they may have been led in the wrong direction, and this recognition that, I travel back between the UK a fair bit, and when you kind of talk to folks there, there's this realization now how far behind the United States the UK is falling, where I think there's this kind of this brief anecdote, but the Bank of England was hiring a chief digital economy officer, someone to basically figure out how to digitize the pound. And the job hiring was somewhere around £90,000. And in the same week, the New York Times said, we're hiring an editorial assistant for one of our columnists, and it was $85,000. And all the kind of policy-minded Brits on Twitter saying, whoa, what's going on here? This very senior Bank of England job pays almost the same, if not less, than a junior level American job. And I think this recognition is starting to take hold in the UK, how much Brexit has left them poorer, not only than their neighbors, or not only than the United States, but also very much their neighbors. And I think it's an interesting question to see how the next few years go in the UK. I mean, I would be surprised if you had a conservative government in 14, 15 months, but that's kind of I'll leave that to the Brits to decide that.
Yeah, I think that's right. In addition to the economic piece, I think there's also a sociological element to this. I mean, if you think about our country, the core, it seems to me, of sort of the Donald Trump electoral base, that maybe that Fifth Avenue crowd that he talks about, that we see still strongly supporting him, and notwithstanding everything that's happening today and elsewhere in his world. That a lot of it is just a sense of things are going out of control. The world is changing. My life is getting worse. And there's an appeal to someone who gets up there and says, I alone can fix it. And I think that's a dynamic. And then the other thing that strikes me is when you look at the global South and you talk about some of the opportunities we squandered, perhaps, in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the wall and the dissolution of the USSR. But I think we've also done that with regard to the global South. And it was pretty much a wake-up moment for many Western leaders when, the majority, or the countries representing the majority of the population of people on the planet, decided to either abstain or vote against fairly basic UN resolution condemning Russian aggression in Ukraine. And, part of that is, there's almost a sense of, hey, a pox on both your houses. You guys promised us economic development. It didn't happen. You promised us high quality vaccinations and vaccines during the COVID crisis. That didn't happen. And we've had a whole, and by the way, we notice that particularly in Europe, you're treating refugees from Ukraine a heck of a lot differently than you treated refugees from, or you are treating refugees from our part of the world. And then finally, of course, you have that long history of imperialism and colonialism and all that people are reacting to. And this also, I think, is if they equate that with democracy, that also might lead to some of the pushback that we've been experiencing as well.
No, I think that's right. And I think that's right. And it's something that comes up at the end of the book where I was kind of thinking, well, if the goal is to strengthen democracy, how do you think about engaging non-democracies? I mean, if you're the Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor of the United States or of the United Kingdom or kind of an equivalent posting in Europe, how are you trying to engage China? How are you trying to engage Saudi Arabia? Because as you're pointing out, the majority of the world's countries are not democracies. And it is something that I think we tend to forget, particularly those of us who are more transatlanticist kind of in orientation, is you forget sometimes that with the exception of, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, a few more countries, most of Asia is autocratic. Most of Africa is autocratic. Latin America is kind of always hovering in the middle. Essentially, all of Central Asia is autocratic. And many of those countries are our partners, where, of course, the Saudis have long been a partner. The Emiratis have long been partners. The Singaporeans have long been partners. And I think it's about figuring out, if you're the United States or the United Kingdom, how to wield those relationships for your own strategic benefit and to make sure you're, for lack of a better phrase, not getting played. Where I think you're kind of seen it a little bit when the changing relationship with Saudi Arabia, where this notion of, I think the Saudis are no longer delivering their end of the bargain. And I think many in Washington are increasingly saying, well, why should we continue supporting this autocratic regime, especially if they're not standing up for kind of the rules-based international order abroad? Whereas on the flip side, the United States really closely engages Vietnam and Singapore, which are certainly not democratic at home, because they like this idea of the rules-based order abroad. They like the idea of countries should not be able to invade other countries, or disputes should be settled peacefully. And I think the United States has, for a variety of presidents, I mean, it differs a little bit, but I think for years, I mean, for decades, it's basically been the recognition of we will continue to engage these autocracies and maybe push them on human rights and governance stuff a little bit quietly and more politely, as long as they abide by this order. And I think that's a reasonable way to go about it. But you can definitely tell that the global South is frustrated with what they consider to be a double standard when it comes to Ukraine. I mean, I think on the really far end of the spectrum, you've critics basically saying, well, why is this any different from Iraq or Afghanistan? Which obviously it is, but I at least understand why developing world leaders kind of get mad about it. And there's also this practical frustration of, well, they say that the Western sanctions are what's undermining their economy, not actually the war itself. I mean, they're saying the war, sure, it's a problem, but it's actually your sanctions. And I think it's a reminder that for many parts of the developing world, including democracies, people are much more focused on economic development and delivering than they are on the democratic ideals. I mean, I think it's much easier for Europeans and Americans to maybe debate the imperfections of democracy, whereas if you're a poorer person in India or a poorer person in Thailand, you're much more focused on, well, can I just vote for the person who's going to give me more handouts? And that's a totally understandable way, I think, for the developing world, for people in the developing world to think, which is one reason why I wanted to write a book that is mostly geared, I would say, towards advanced economies, but it's gotten positive reviews in Indian media from folks saying, at least he talks about this notion of democracy needs to deliver. Democracy is not just about elections. It is about having a government that functions and can actually improve people's lives. So
that is a really good point. And I think it also gets back to the hollowing out of the manufacturing base in the United States and the fact that both, not to say that, Bernie Sanders is autocratic, but both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in the 2016 elections were able to kind of key into that and to great political advantage in both of those primaries, and ultimately for Trump in the general election. And I think it also suggests, when you talk about delivering, again, another mistake we made by allowing China and in fact Russia to have such open field running throughout the developing world and the global South in particular. And I mean, obviously, it's the invasion that led to the sanctions, and of course, the sanctions have nothing to do with the global food crisis that we're seeing, that's exacerbated by this war. But if we're not there telling that story and helping to exacerbate those problems on the ground, then Lavrov, Trump's foreign minister, gets to run around through Africa and say, hey, if you back us in this, that, or the other thing, we'll get you your food, and almost weaponizing, from a political sense, the food crisis. So, I mean, hopefully we've learned something from that, and I know that's an area of big discussion in the UN as well. and can move forward. Well, let's this also, your point about delivering, suggests one of the points you make in the book is that the threat to democracy is both internal and external. I assume the internal piece is in part, hey, if we don't deliver to our own citizens, you're going to get this. But why don't you, unpack that concept a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we've gone over many of these internal threats in the last 20 minutes of course, this notion of, well, if the system does not deliver, as you can kind of talk about with the hollowing out of the manufacturing base in the Rust Belt, is certainly a reason why people in the Rust Belt are now open to kind of a Trump type or kind of someone with an autocratic impulse, the idea of the one man who can fix it. And certainly you've seen that elsewhere. You've seen it in Italy, kind of really around the world. That is the internal threat to me, is if the system doesn't work full on, people will just reject it and begin to consider something different. And I will say this is more of a European issue than an American issue, but certainly in the US, we consider this internal threat to be mostly on the far right. And I think that's mostly right. Whereas in Europe, you do have folks on the far left. I mean, like further left than our left could possibly be, basically arguing, and I think it's a Danish scholar and a French scholar who have said climate change is bigger than democracy. And there's this notion of you need kind of a climate dictator. You need someone to come in and without kind of the checks and balances of democracy, basically say, you can't take X number of vacations a year. You can't drive this kind of car. You're limited on how many, how long you can run your air conditioner, all these things. And I think that's kind of a separate internal threat. And then it is kind of the explicit not delivering on economic issues one. But it's a real concern, I think, you see among younger people, particularly in Europe, who are feeling like this older crop of politicians have totally failed to kind of account for climate change. So there's this openness to something different. So that is the internal threat, is the openness to an autocrat, either for climate purposes, economic purposes, but just this notion of systemic failure that requires something new. And in terms of the external threats, I mean, there's the practical one. I tend to believe when you have a one-man system like in Russia, where it revolves around a singular person, you are much more open to, I mean, there's a higher possibility of war. I mean, basically, the notion being that Putin was so surrounded by acolytes who were either too scared to tell him the truth about the invasion, or frankly, the system was so dysfunctional that they didn't know the war was going to go badly. But the point being, no one was able to say no. So there is this practical threat of living next to an autocracy like that, as you can kind of see, obviously, with Ukraine. And my kind of even neighboring nearby countries like Poland and Moldova are now kind of freaking out about, well, what do we do? I think that's one very like hard power external problem. And there's also the problem of, well, how do Russia, China, and other kind of malign actors, including the Saudis, who will have lots of lobbyists in Washington, kind of interfere in domestic politics? And I think the argument, and I'm not the first one to make it, is that those external challenges, those external threats are only successful if you have internal problems. Where the only I think until, and also I do think it's a little bit of a cop-out sometimes, where I've heard for the last 6-7 years, well, Trump only won in 2016 because the Russians interfered. I think it's a little bit of a cop-out and neglects the fact that actually there is that internal, there is this internal impulse of people feeling like it's not working, but that when you have those problems internally, you open yourself up to disinformation or misinformation from China, from Russia, and whatnot. So that's how I think about the issues being internal and external. But frankly, I mean, as I said in the book, I'm much more worried about the internal than the external. I don't think China's growing power is an existential threat to U.S. democracy. Certainly, I'm very concerned by much of China's behavior, but the threats to American democracy in particular are internal.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's interesting. I'm listening to you talk about the lone dictator and having just people around who are going to support what their point of view is, yes men, if you will, reluctance to challenge. When you look at China and you look at Russia in particular, and you look at how they are completely controlling the information flow within their countries, basically eliminating any vestige of a free press or reporting of alternative points of view or perhaps real facts within the country, they pay a price for that. And the example I always use on that is Putin had to be shocked at how poorly prepared his military was. And I am sure that Putin and others, maybe even in the senior leadership of the military, were shocked when they opened the cupboards and saw that a whole lot of those weapons, those smart weapons that they'd spent billions and billions of rubles on over the years, weren't there because of corruption and fraud and people taking the semiconductors out of those weapons and selling them on the black market, what have you. And the interesting thing is, if you had a free press with investigative reporters, I guarantee if something like that was happening in the US military, Joe Biden wouldn't need his Pentagon folks to tell him about it. It would be reported. You'd have whistleblowers, you'd have investigative reporters and other things. And what's interesting about it is when you can contain or eliminate any true sense of a free press in your country, you're also severely limiting the amount of information and the quality of the information that you're going to receive as a leader. Anyway, a little bit off point.
No. I absolutely agree. And I think it actually gets into some of the points I made about kind of innovation in democracies, where we have this ability to rejuvenate ourselves precisely because we have open societies with open media. And as much as something like the Pentagon Papers or leaks of other nature is kind of damaging in the short term to the existing president, it's embarrassing for the existing president. Maybe it's embarrassing when you have some similar leaks up, in the Senate or the House. It's actually quite good for democracy because it exposes these things to the public, and it exposes these things to a broader set of lawmakers who are then required to actually go about fixing things. And there's no question. I mean, when you think about China too, one of the reasons why I think, at least, why China lacks some of this advanced technology, why China still relies on US tech for semiconductors, for all these advanced things, or why much of the world's best art and novels all come out of the West, is because we have open societies that do actually encourage debate and encourage innovation. So it is a real problem. It's kind of an existential problem for autocracies. And I think I said in the book, the only real exception to this is Singapore. And Singapore is the exceptional autocracy. And I think the point I've made is, well, Singapore is the exceptional autocracy because Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of the country, essentially built a system in this image and did, frankly, a very kind of good job of building a functional system. But it's a system that no autocracy could actually hope to model today. Because if China or Russia says, well, we want to be like Singapore now, you'd have to tear down this system that has graft built into it. I mean, you'd have to tear down the existing Russian system to build up the meritocratic, accountable, reasonably clean Singaporean one. So Singapore, to me, is the exception of the very high-functioning, innovative autocracy. But we certainly don't have the same challenge, I think, from China or Russia or the Saudis.
And of course, the danger is if you have a system that's set up to sustain and support a benevolent dictatorship, the next guy who comes along might not be so benevolent, and it takes a while to.
Well, exactly. It's the bad son syndrome is the problem.
Yeah, the bad son. I love that. Yeah,
but it's true. I mean, and you see it to a variety. I mean, certainly, Bashar al-Assad's father was not good, but you can clearly see that Bashar al-Assad himself is completely incompetent and has been for a long time. And you do see that at play in other autocracies where it's now this ongoing problem in Cambodia, where I used to live, where the father is now thinking about passing power to his son. And the father has all this legitimacy from being kind of a war hero and delivering the country out of genocide and poverty and actually developing the country in one way or another, and has some legitimacy from older people for that. Whereas the son is pampered. He went to West Point. He's grown up kind of rich and in all this kind of away from the normal public. And it remains completely unclear to me and to Cambodians if he's actually going to be effective. So it is a clear problem of autocracies. If you do run the risk of, well, you can have a benevolent person for 20, 30 years, in theory, or quasi-benevolent. I would never call autocracy benevolent, but a reasonably functional autocrat. And then that person disappears, dies or whatnot. And then you have the incompetent son who's maybe less functional. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, exactly. You can just watch the movie Gladiator again. Hey, let's talk about solutions now. We've sort of diagnosed the problem. We've given a number of reasons for it. We've given some of the challenges, that democracies face, and that actually just now autocratic regimes face. What are your principal points for how we should meet this challenge? What mechanisms are there for solidifying and promoting democracy?
Sure. I mean, I think broadly speaking, I'm a believer in spreading democracy by making our own democracies look like models again. The idea being that when the US, the UK, Japan, Korea, Australia, the list goes on, when we perform so well in terms of economics and governance, that people in Vietnam and Egypt want to be like us, not like Singapore, not like the UAE, not like China. That's the mode, I think, to spreading democracy and promoting democracy down the line. I mean, it's a decidedly non-interventionist approach. I'm certainly not arguing the West should look to overthrow the government of Vietnam and put in place a democracy. It's more, it never works. And I think the moral aspect of doing so is dubious, to put it politely. Instead, my book offers a roadmap for democracies to set an example. And when we set this good example, we can ensure that more people around the world look to us as a model for good governance and economic flourishing. The idea being that when we offer a roadmap to prosperity, other countries will be more likely to follow our example. And I think something that we maybe don't talk about so much in the West is the notion that, as you were talking about before, well, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, travels around Africa. China's kind of similar officials travel around Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. And they basically tell these guys, well, we'll build you a road. You know, the Americans come and lecture you about human rights and they can't do trade deals because it's against their domestic politics. Well, we'll do a trade deal and we'll build you a road. And if you're a leader in Malaysia or a leader in Angola and you're focused on, well, maybe lining your pockets a little bit, but really in theory delivering for your people, that's a much more attractive offer. So I think this idea being that the United States and our fellow democracies actually demonstrate that we can be these models once again. And so to do so, I've spent 8 chapters and 8 different principles of what I consider good governance. So it's admittedly an aspirational roadmap. I think some of these are more practical than others at the moment. But the way I thought about it, the way I structured the book was I opened up with looking at meritocracy and talked about ancient China, which actually founded the concept of meritocracy with its civil service exam, maybe 3,000 years ago. I'm trying to do my math right. 2,500 years ago, a very long time ago. It was an ancient Chinese king leader who basically came up with the idea of let's actually have have tests for civil servants rather than just choosing from what we might, call the old boys club today. So it looks at ancient China and modern Singapore, which in its civil service kind of staffs similarly. Second, I looked at this notion of accountability and thinking about why democracies must do better at holding powerful people accountable, whether that's wrongdoing in the private sector or in the government. And I think I was slightly overtaken by events in terms of, I think I wrote at the time that Trump had not been charged with anything. Clearly I think I said he should be, but I'm not a lawyer, so I won't make a decision, but we've gotten there at that moment. But thinking about a country like Malaysia, which is kind of a not troubled democracy, but not the most high functioning of ones, has actually put his former Prime Minister Najib Razak, who was very corrupt, in prison. And everyone thought, oh, he'll get pardoned. And we're almost a year and a half in and he has not gotten pardoned. And it's a really strong message of accountability, I think, not only for Asia, but beyond. And then third, I looked at this notion of reestablishing trust in government. And I actually spent a lot of time on the unlikely suspect of Vietnam, which is a one-party state, to actually look at why that country has established so much trust in the government. And the answer, to kind of put bluntly, is, well, it's economic success, but it's also the government has very intentionally embarked on a policy of trust creation, where people actually in Hanoi are thinking, well, how do we communicate with our public to win the most trust? And certainly democracy should not necessarily emulate Vietnam, but there is a broader need to, I think, for leaders to be more honest with their people to help win back trust. Fourth, I looked at the idea of making long-term plans. And I think we all recognize that, well, our Congress people are elected every 2 years, seem to be, governed for a year and then focus on election for a year. And it does feel sometimes like the West can't think beyond the next 4 years, 6 years, 8 years. Whereas, of course, China has their 5-year plans. Saudi Arabia has Vision 2030, which is this grand goal to kind of fundamentally reshape the country. But instead of looking at those countries so much, I actually spent a lot of time looking at the West's private sector to make the point that the best companies are the ones with the most long-term planning. And there are these quotes from Jeff Bezos, from Tim Cook, folks who have basically said, well, there are all these products that if I wanted them to be profitable in a year, we never would have launched them. I'm forgetting which Amazon product it was, but maybe it was when Amazon bought Kindle, I think. It was something to that effect, that it actually wouldn't have been profitable within 2, 3, 4 years. And I think Bezos said, well, we need 5 to 6 years. And I think there's a lesson that democracies can take there. So chapter 5, I moved on to look at the social safety net. And I spent a lot of time on Denmark, because I think when you talk to Americans or you read, Francis Fukuyama very famously called getting to Denmark is what he described as getting to the ideal democracy, because Denmark has this very high quality social safety net, really high social mobility, all that. And I spent a lot of time on Denmark because even Denmark's social safety net is struggling. And Denmark's social mobility has also declined. And the diagnosis I gave is that because that social safety net is designed for a world that does not exist anymore. It's designed for this world in which people spend 20 years maybe at the same employer. Maybe they work 3 or 4 jobs in their lifetimes, where certainly my generation, the generation above me, that is no longer the case. People spend 2 years at a job and move. And people also, there are more gig economy workers than ever before, whether that's an Uber driver, a digital nomad, a bakery owner, all these things. And the Europe's safety nets don't really account for it. And certainly the US safety net has an array of problems, but rather than, it's not a US centric book really. So I spent a lot of time in that chapter thinking about, well, if you're Japan, South Korea, United States, Denmark, how can you think about incorporating these gig workers into your safety net? And then chapter 6, I looked at human capital, which this is the one where I actually think there's been the most movement on since the book was, I guess, completed a little under a year ago and published 3 or 4 months ago, where you've seen things like the CHIPS Act, you've seen efforts like the Inflation Reduction Act, you've seen Europe now has their own CHIPS Act, the UK is putting forward their semiconductor plan, all of these efforts to attract, basically to encourage people to study these things, to actually be able to make semiconductors and to attract investment from semiconductor firms in friendly countries. And I think that there's clearly more to be done there, but it's a positive first step. And then chapter 7, I looked at infrastructure. And again, the United States stands out here, where by most ratings, we have the worst infrastructure in the advanced world. And you can kind of see it with I-95 collapsing 2 hours from me, I guess 2 days ago. But I looked at kind of the Asian miracles of the past, of China, South Korea, Japan, to really explain about how when these countries, and of course in Japan, kind of during the US occupation, a lot of that was US money, was spent into building up infrastructure with the notion that, well, when you have high quality roads, when you have high quality bridges, you're going to encourage commerce. Whereas you've now seen on the other side, there are estimates that Australia's infrastructure in its big cities is not up to date, and it will not be able to handle the mass urbanization of the country. And I think the idea is it could cost them $300 million a year. And certainly you see similar things in the United States, but I think one focus of that chapter was also beyond just traditional infrastructure. It's beyond bridges. It's also thinking about, well, who's laying the fiber optic cables of the future? And particularly for companies, there's not much of a profit motivation to lay high quality internet cables in rural Tennessee or in rural Michigan. So there's a need for the government to step in and provide some kind of subsidy, some kind of assistance, because when more people in our kind of ever connected world have high quality internet, they can participate in conversations like this one, they can found their own business online, and it's a way to encourage growth and I think boost faith in democracy. And the last chapter, and I'm realizing I've gone on along, so bear with me, the last chapter is talking about immigration. And this is probably the chapter in which I've gotten the most questions, actually less so in US media, more so in foreign media, because I think the United States, we've essentially decided that the way we're going to account for our poor fertility rates, which are not near the 2.1 children per woman number that demographers say is needed for kind of a healthy balance. We're at 1.6, 1.7. We've basically said we're going to account for that low number with more immigrants. We're going to continue attracting highly educated folks from South Asia or from East Asia. We're going to continue accepting refugees. I think that's certainly Europe is not quite on that same page at the moment. And critically, Japan and South Korea are very much not on that same page. And Japan and South Korea have worse fertility rates than we do. Korea's is actually the worst in the world, which is now 0.78. And they have no plans to really kind of bring in this mass number of immigrants they're going to actually need. And I wanted to, in that chapter, basically give this practical case of, well, we actually are going to need more immigrants to be our tax base. Practically, immigrants also innovate more than native-born Americans. They open new businesses more than native-born Americans. That's true in Europe as well. And on kind of this emotional level, every time you see, a scientist give up their Chinese passport for an American one, or their Russian passport for a British one, it testifies to all that democracies can offer and all that autocracies can't. It makes very clear to me that the world's best innovations, the most creative people, they want to come to our societies despite our problems because of all we offer, because of how open we are. And I think the examples I gave is the famous mini car in the UK. It was founded by a Greek immigrant. Marks and Spencer's was founded by a Belarusian immigrant. Google, of course, was founded by one immigrant from the Soviet Union in the United States. There is a practical case for immigration, but there is also very much, I think, this moral case. So that's the eight items I spent 300 pages on trying to flesh out solutions. And certainly my goal was not, I don't think people will agree with all of them, but the idea was to put some solutions on paper in the hopes that, leaders, local officials, readers and whatnot kind of can say, well, maybe some of these work in kind of bits and pieces.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. And thanks for that comprehensive overview. I think on the immigration piece, that's so important. I've seen amazing statistics about the percentage. I don't have it offhand, but it's a fairly high percentage of, Fortune 100 or S&P 500 companies that were founded by immigrants. I mean, significant. When I was ambassador and we had the refugee crisis in Germany and Merkel said Wir schaffen das and was getting so much heat for that, I kept saying, hey guys, you got a huge demographic problem here, and this is potentially a solution for that. And I think in retrospect, Germany actually did a pretty effective job of integrating a lot of the refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and other places. But in any event, that continues to be a point of tension, and that we need to always be thinking about the positive aspect of that as well. Look, I've seen we've got 19 questions now on the Q&A bar. We also have in the chat bar a link for people to buy this book. So I would recommend that you all do that. It's well written. It's a quick read, great storytelling, and obviously on a very, very important issue and a different approach to that issue. More, how can we solve it rather than what created it? So Rachel, let me turn to you and let's go to our audience questions and take it from there.
Thank you both so much for joining us today. And as you mentioned, we have a lot of great audience questions. So I'll start with this one. You mentioned the US not paying enough attention to the preservation of democracy after the Cold War. Isn't the US now doing the same with the dictatorship in China? The PRC's Belt and Road Initiative appears to be the classic example of our having our heads in the political and economic sand globally.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. And what I've noticed, I mentioned in the book a little bit, I think we talked about it briefly, is it's the biggest problem when US officials engage their counterparts in the developing world, particularly in Asia and Africa, where they say, the developing world leaders say, well, China comes to us and offers bridges, you offer us a lecture. And the irony there is the inability of the United States to marshal funds for something like a kind of a democratic BRI, or even for free trade deals, is a reflection of our own difficult politics, where essentially, I mean, as John mentioned, of course, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are both against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have been this massive trade deal with Asia that would have allowed the United States and our partners to kind of set the rules of the road in Asia, rather than kind of cede much of the region to kind of China's economic influence. What people seem to forget is actually Hillary Clinton during the campaign also caved on TPP. She reversed course and said, well, the TPP, I won't sign it in, because there was so much American domestic discontent about manufacturing, about outsourcing these jobs, about saying, well, the Vietnamese workers will take my job and whatnot. And I think that was a failure of communication on kind of by many kind of pro-TPP politicians. But it was also a reflection of the fact that the system hasn't been working for 20 years. And that people in Illinois or people in Tennessee or people, beyond the Acela corridor, beyond Los Angeles, San Francisco, whatnot, we're basically saying, well, why should we give the Asians so much money? Or why should we give Africans so much money? If you're thinking about kind of similar deals in other parts of the world. So to me, this inability to marshal funds abroad is a reflection of our own domestic politics. And I will say the Biden administration is trying to kind of compete with the BRI, where you have, I forget, the Partnership for Global Investment, Partnership for Global Investments in this G7 effort. And I think they have promised to marshal something like $300 million for infrastructure spending particularly in the developing world, I think for Africa, Asia, beyond. But that $300 million is much less than China has offered the BRI, but something that I think is that's in our advantage actually is that when you talk to developing world leaders, you talk to developing world officials, sure, there's this interest in China's roads and bridges because they're built faster. But actually, many leaders would still prefer the West to help them on infrastructure because our infrastructure tends to last longer. It tends to just be better. Whereas you often hear stories. I mean, if you Google China bridge collapse Africa, there may be 100,000 results. Or China hospital collapse Africa. Some of the stuff happened in Cambodia when I was living there as well, where basically developing world leaders say, well, China will build this thing really fast and for maybe less money than the West, less red tape. Come in, build it, and it collapses 3 years later. And then you have this question of, well, why did we do that? So I think we do have this advantage of, as much as Russia and China run around the world throwing money at developing world leaders, they still do want investment from us. And as much as the United States might be too riven by domestic political breakdown at the moment to actually marshal those funds, we do have partners in Europe who are. And we do certainly have partners in Japan and South Korea who spend a lot of money in Asia kind of helping these efforts. So maybe not as doom and gloom as the question indicates, but I agree that we're not necessarily doing enough on this front either.
So we've had a couple of questions come in along this vein, but this audience member says, it seems that fundamental people infrastructure and natural resources infrastructure have a lot to do with capacity to build a country, democratic or authoritarian. In people infrastructure, one has education, past history, etc. For natural resources, we've had a lot to build upon. Many countries don't. Please comment on how much these matters have to do with the freedom to develop the way a country might wish to develop.
That's a really smart question. And I actually think something I answered in the book is I privilege number one over number two. Whereas there are two ends of the spectrum here in terms of one autocracy, one democracy that have essentially no natural resources, but spend a lot of money on people resources or people infrastructure, as kind of the question put it. And those are Singapore and Japan. Neither Singapore nor Japan have any real amount of natural resources in a meaningful way. I mean, it's not like Saudi Arabia or the UAE where it's all oil money. Singapore realized we have no natural infrastructure or natural resources. We're a very small country. Let's invest a lot of money from the start in education. Let's invest a lot of money in physical infrastructure. I mean, in kind of just roads and bridges. But really, it was investment in education. It was investment in hospitals, in social assistance, in a meritocratic government, and the notion that, well, let our best resource be our people. And Japan did it democratically, but did something reasonably similar while also marshaling a lot of funds for physical infrastructure like roads and bridges and whatnot. But neither one have these oil funds to kind of lean on like much of the Gulf does. Certainly, I mean, we can give Saudi Arabia and UAE credit for developing these big skyscrapers and all that, but they're doing it mostly with oil funds that, of course, Singapore and Japan don't have. So I don't think natural resources are a prerequisite to developing a functional society. I think they can help if you have strong institutions. If Japan was to find $2 billion worth of critical minerals tomorrow, certainly they'd be in a good place to kind of make the profit from that. But it's not necessary for national success. I really do think that investing in infrastructure, our physical infrastructure, social safety nets, education is really, really critical. And I think you can see that in the Singapore and Japan examples.
This next audience member said, mayors and governors are the ones that people feel and see delivering. They also can or not preserve the norms of democracy within an authoritarian context. What is the role of mayors, governors, and local governments in renewing democracy here and overseas?
So it's really critical, and it's something I talked about in the book in terms of actually long-term planning, where I think local officials are actually a little bit better at it at times than maybe congressional representatives, where if you are the mayor of a smaller city, maybe a Nashville or a Louisville, you're certainly more tapped into your local constituents' concerns than the senators are, and certainly than the president is. And I think there is this idea of mayors, and even to some extent, mayors, local council people, whatever, to actually focus on long-term plans, and because they might be a little bit more disconnected from the kind of chaos of national politics, where I think if you talk to the average council member or the average local representative in some of these states, some of these cities, people tend to be a little bit more sane and a little bit more focused on actual problem solving than in kind of the national political conversation. And I think retaining that focus on the citizenry is really critical. And one thing I did say in terms of long-term planning is I didn't lean into this idea of citizens' assemblies exactly, but I did say that, voters are by nature selfish in the sense that they want what's best for them. And I think local officials tend to represent that in actually a very positive way, where it's selfishness, but it's selfishness in terms of, well, how can I make my community better? Whereas you see, local officials, I think, tend to have a better pulse on it than congressional representatives in terms of, well, should we give Amazon tax breaks to come here and build a factory and create a lot of jobs? Maybe on the Senate level, maybe there's some bigger issue about labor and concerns about big business. You say, no, I don't want to do that. It's not in my ideology. Where I think local officials tend to be less trapped by ideology, which I think can risk stymieing democratic governance. So I do think mayors, governors, to some extent, do have an opportunity to maybe govern a little bit and a little bit better and slightly more detached from the chaotic political discourse, to put it politely.
I think there's a reason why governors tend to do better in presidential preference polls than senators, as an example.
Absolutely.
And the appeal of business people when they run, look at the number of wealthy business people who have, been able to self-fund Senate campaigns or even gubernatorial campaigns. I mean, you still have that. You have that dynamic there as well. Yeah, I thought that was an interesting question.
So you touched on this a little bit during the program, but can you discuss the benefits of peaceful transitions of power and what happens when countries don't have an effective leadership succession plan?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually, as I was saying before, a little bit of the crisis on display in Cambodia at the moment, where the ruling prime minister has been in power 37 years at this point, and has, centered this system around him. And he's relatively young, early 70s, doesn't seem to be going off the grid anytime soon. But there is this open question of, well, how do you actually manage a non-democratic transition to a son who the public doesn't like and the other elites don't like? Because the elites are saying, well, why can't my son have power? Why do we have to give it to this other guy? Why continue the same generational power? And you do run into the risk of having a completely unmoored process, or you do run the risk of, public backlash in terms of protests in the streets, or elite backlash where you kind of have these behind the scenes trying to remove the guy. And either way, it's not good for economic development. It's not good for government services. And certainly Cambodia is at the lower end of the spectrum, but it is a problem. I mean, again, more down the line, because he's not particularly old, but it is a problem down the line when you think about in China as well, where Xi has centralized power very much around him. And I think there is no clear answer of, who is the successor? When you don't have a clear succession plan, you don't have a powerful kind of government managing that succession plan, you do run the risk of destabilization, both politically and in terms of just basic business practices or economic activity. And then on the flip side, of course, is Singapore, where Singapore did very much effectively manage the transition from Lee Kuan Yew to the next leader back to Lee Hsien Loong, who's the current prime minister, who's Lee Kuan Yew's son. And they've already picked the next guy, who's going to be Lawrence Wong, who's the finance minister, who's now already been elevated as kind of the successor in waiting. And it's been pretty smooth because there's this recognition of it being a reasonably meritocratic selection process. It's not, just the son being chosen. I think there actually are descendants of the Lee family that they said are not qualified, and basically said, we'd rather go with the qualified finance minister than the nepotism hire. So clearly these peaceful transitions to power are absolutely vital to the functioning of a state. I mean, democratic or autocratic. I mean, obviously, January 6th was a very dark moment around the world where I think people looked at the United States and said, well, this is chaos. And certainly, I think if you're sitting in Beijing, you said, well, that's a good moment for us. Whereas if you're an American partner in Europe or in Korea or Japan, it was a very concerning moment. So it clearly very critical to both democratic and autocratic systems.
So I want to turn to a couple of questions about specific countries as we're nearing the end of the hour. But could you discuss the impact of decisions made by Boris Yeltsin in regards to Russia's return to autocracy?
Yeah, I mean, I will admit that I'm not a Russia expert, but my understanding of the way this happened was essentially Yeltsin basically was kind of reasonably incompetent in terms of managing the country's transition to a democratic capitalist system. The kind of Harvard-trained economists who showed up to help him didn't really help him in the most effective way. And he did kind of choose Putin as saying, well, this guy will stand for election and then he'll kind of eventually leave because it's a democratic system. And essentially, he just bet on the wrong horse. I mean, he chose a guy who was so ruthless and so unwilling to ever give up power that he just refused to leave. And it's not the first time that's happened. I mean, there's a number of stories of people, in a quasi-democratic system, kind of choosing this person to kind of follow you and saying, well, they'll be there for 8 years and then leave, and then they never leave. So Yeltsin, I think, managed the economic process of capitalization quite poorly, of liberalization quite poorly, and then just chose the wrong successor, kind of on a baseline level.
And
question, Rachel, that was begged by a couple of the comments that I read through, and it's sort of the idea of almost hypocrisy when you're talking about democracies, democratic values, and dealing with dictatorships when the national interest suggests that. And probably the best recent example of that is the sort of the reaction people had to the fist bump with Biden and MBS in Saudi Arabia. My guess is he did the fist bump because he didn't want to actually shake his hand. I mean, it just completely backfired. It looked worse. But and of course, that's back in the news as we see this, consternation over the Live PGA merger or acquisition, whatever it is. But could you talk a little bit about that? How should democracies deal with autocracies in this sort of real world sense? And of course, we have this with China and the Uyghurs and all that as well.
I think you can put many of these autocracies in two separate camps. Or maybe there's a gradation of kind of friendly to non-friendly, where, of course, at the one end of the spectrum is North Korea and Iran that are completely unfriendly and completely unhelpful. Whereas maybe the other end of the spectrum, you have Singapore, which is very helpful on a variety of issues. They like to engage with us. They're an economic partner. They're a security partner. They, express criticism because they don't like our China policy sometimes, but, friends can have disagreements. And there are countries in the middle where it's not exactly, I think in years past, you might have put Saudi Arabia more at the friendly end of the spectrum of saying, well, they give us the oil we need. They let us stage our military forces there for critical purposes. But I think under MBS, there's been a shift actually maybe away from the friendly towards the closer to the China spectrum of saying, well, we don't like this international order that is US and Western dominated. Maybe we can build our own, or maybe we can build our own regional order. And maybe that was with the help of China. I mean, you saw that Xi Jinping maybe 4 or 5 months ago convened 20-something Arab leaders in Riyadh and held this summit with the Arab leaders, including countries that are traditional U.S. partners. And if you actually look at the photo, the most traditional U.S. partners are the ones directly next to Xi. And that was an intentional move to basically say, well, whatever the U.S.-led international order here hasn't worked for us. So we, being the Saudis, might work with the Chinese to build something a little bit similar. So that is how I would think about it in terms of, well, we need to be actively watching how the Saudis approach our national interests. And that is basically going to determine to me how you engage with them, where certainly, clearly China over the last 30 years has shifted dramatically as well. We thought, well, China's a trading partner, we outsource jobs and et cetera, and back and forth, and it works for both partners. And, I think it's the famous Bob Zoellick quote that China would be a responsible stakeholder in this order, and that hasn't happened. So I think it is figuring out, well, how do we make sure that we're not being played? How do we make sure that our interests are aligned with our relationships with autocracies? And I think that is frankly mostly the case in our relationship with Singapore. I think it's mostly the case in our relationship with Vietnam, but it is still a work in progress to figure out, well, how do we actually handle the Saudis? Do we cut off all ties with Saudi Arabia? So, no, I don't think that's productive. I don't think that'd be productive with China either. Certainly, each country is going to require their own kind of policy, but I think the way we're approaching China at the moment of saying, well, let's not send advanced dual-use technology that could be used for military purposes. Let's not allow that to get to China. That's fine with me. I think that makes a lot of sense. Certainly, we're going to keep talking to the Chinese so we can maybe avoid an accidental confrontation in the South China Sea or something. That's good. I think you should maintain open lines of communication. I don't think there's anything problematic about that. There's nothing problematic about an American company saying, well, I want to sell refrigerators to Chinese consumers. That's not a problem. But once you cross the line into kind of high tech stuff like semiconductors that can be used for missiles and all that, that is a very different conversation. And I think you're seeing the Biden administration basically figure out, well, how are we going to treat these kind of national security related issues?
Sort of the reverse CFIUS process.
Yeah, exactly.
Being discussed. Anyway, sorry, Rachel, we've got 1 minute left. You got any more final questions you want to throw out?
No, that's okay. That was a great question. So I thank you again so much for being here, both of you, and I'll turn it back over to you to wrap up.
All right. Well, thanks so much. Thank you, Rachel. Thanks, Kim. Thanks always the Los Angeles World Affairs Council for at Town Hall for your the public service that you all provide in putting these kinds of sessions either on Zoom or in person. So, and I will just note that we got a couple of shout outs, Charles, from fellow Hamilton College alumni.
Oh, nice.
Our school does not have that big an alumni base, so it's nice to see them on board as well. But Kim, back to you.
Charles and John, this was so spectacular. We learned so much today. And just a reminder again, Charles's new book is Defeating the Dictators, How Democracy Can Prevail in the Age of the Strongman. And we have information on that book in our chat. So I'm going to order it right after this live stream. I can't wait. And I'm just going to share just a couple notes. John and Charles have a couple upcoming programs before we sign off. This Thursday, we have the new president and CEO from the RAND Corporation who just joined our board, Jason Matheny, and he'll be talking about AI and democracy. So don't miss that live stream. And then on June 20th, one of our board members just came out with a great new book, Driving Force, LA's Impact on the Early Auto Industry. It's a great story. There was actually this phenomenal woman who shaped the car industry in the early 20th century. And then lastly, we have on June 27th, an in-person event with Dr. Colin Clark. He's the director of research at the Sufan Group, and he will be talking about the Wagner Group's expanding global footprint. So check out our website, register today, and join us Thursday for Jason Matheny from the RAND Corporation. So thank you so much, John and Charles, again. We hope to have you back soon.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.